Do we need to do roll?
We need to call the meeting to order first.
So, good morning, everyone. We're officially calling this meeting of the K-3 Literacy Ad Hoc Advisory Committee to order. And I'm going to hand it over to Alicia to
Melissa,
do the next two steps.
Dana Burke, Angel Canto, Carmen Castro, Carmen Castro.
Oh, here.
Terry Clark.
Here.
Oh, sorry.
Heather Cruz.
Here.
Dr. Don Foley.
Here.
Don Gerundo.
Here.
Amy Hamilton. Aaron Hart.
Here.
Dr. Kyan McMillie. Karen Ortiz.
Here.
Audrey Reff. Deborah Vickman.
Here.
Patricia Wellborn.
Here. Angel here. Sorry.
Oh, thank you. You have a quorum.
The first item on the agenda is a presentation discussion regarding the organization, duties, and responsibilities of the committee. So thank you to all of the committee members for serving on this ad hoc committee of the State Board of Education. As you are aware, this committee was first established about 2 years ago to revise and look over the Move On When Reading statute, which this committee did revise. It was passed at the legislature, and Mr. Sean Ross from the department will be speaking on that during item 4 today. So the State Board really would like this committee to review currently available Move On When Reading data and have discussions on early literacy. So it's not just looking at that third grade cohort, but really what needs to happen in terms of all early literacy. Of course, I went out of order with what I wrote down, but the goal of this committee is provide a report to the board by the December 3rd State Board meeting. This report should discuss the current climate of Move On When Reading, but also address areas within early literacy that need improvement. Recommendations on changes within the statute or current practices within the field, areas of further study and research can also be addressed. The State Board staff is here to assist this committee with their work and will provide information and guidance as needed. Today really is about what we know and what we need to figure out if we don't know it. Feel free to ask questions today during our presentations. And if you need more information on any of the information that is presented today, staff will bring what we can to the next meeting and provide that to the committee members. The next agenda item is the presentation, discussion, and consideration to elect a chair and co-chair. So we will do this with a motion of a chair, followed by a second, with a discussion if needed, and then all in favor, opposed, etc. So do we have a motion for a chair for this committee?
Yes. I make a motion to elect Terry Clark as chair of this committee.
Do we have a second?
Second.
Ms. Terry Clark, do you accept this nomination?
I do.
All in favor of this nomination?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Terry Clark will be the chair of this committee. Do I have a motion for a co-chair?
I'd like to nominate Dr. Don Foley from Mesa.
Do we have a second?
Second.
Any discussion? Ms. Foley, or Dr. Foley, do you? Okay.
Yes.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Motion carries. So Chairwoman Clark and the co-chair or vice chair, when Terry Clark's not available, will be Dr. Don Foley. So thank you, ladies. And then and now Chair Clark, you can take over from here.
Thank you. Thank you. Do we do the call to the public?
We did not receive any requests to speak.
We can skip that then. So the next item on the agenda is a presentation and discussion of the overview of Move On When Reading and implementation of changes to the legislation in 2017. And we have Sean Ross to do. Thank you, Sean.
Hi, thanks for having me. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Sean Ross. I am the Director of English Language Arts and Move On When Reading for the Arizona Department of Education. Prior to that, I was a classroom teacher for 15 years. I was a teacher mentor. I was an instructional coach. Wore a bunch of hats. And so I've been in education since 2000. And I'm really excited to talk to you today because I was present for the last iteration, as most of you were, of this subcommittee. And I wanted today to just cover some of the changes that were made by that group that were passed into legislation last year. So I always begin, whenever I speak about Move On When Reading, I always start with this slide because unfortunately the move on portion of the name gets most of the headlines. But the reality is the spirit of the legislation is far different. It's really designed to promote early identification and targeted intervention so that all kids are reading at or above grade level by the end of third grade. And that's really not just the spirit of the legislation, but it's the spirit of the Move On When Reading team at the ADE as well. This is really what we're about. It's why we're devoting our lives to this. And so I always like to open with that to kind of remind what our values are. So I'm going to go through some of the changes that were made by the committee in the last session. And I'm actually going to use that as a way to also do a reminder of some of the components of Move On When Reading. Please feel free to stop me if you have any questions. I'm happy to answer. And if I'm going too quickly, let me know as well. Just throw something at me. So I wanted to begin with funding. So Move On When Reading is a $45 million annual program. And the money goes to schools to support K-3 reading. It averages around $145 per K-3 student per school every year. So it's a good amount of funding, depending on student count. And the funding can be used in one of four buckets. So it can be used for staffing, K-3 instructional materials, such as a core reading program or an intervention program. It can be used for K-3 assessment materials, like a universal screener or a diagnostic. And it can be used for K-3 professional development. The funding, one of the things that we like about this funding in particular is it's a bit more open than, say, title funding. It doesn't have the supplement, not supplant rules on it, so it can be used a little bit more flexibly. And I know schools have been pretty happy about that. So in the last session with the Ad Hoc Literacy Committee, there was actually one of the changes that was put forward is our school finance department collects data on how the K-3 funding is allotted, but we didn't have more specific data on how it was used. And so that was proposed by this group. It was changed in legislation. So we now collect data on how that money is used. And actually, here's some of
Sean,
that data.
can I ask you a question before we move on?
Uh-huh.
Of the $45 million, am I correct in understanding that it goes to any school regardless of funding needs? So, for example, a basis school or a Scottsdale school receives the same per student funding as a Title I school?
Yeah, so the funding is per pupil. And it's to any public or charter school.
Per pupil regardless of demographics?
Yeah. Yes.
So, and it's any students in K-3.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're in our 6th year. We've spent 6 times $45 million, $270 million on the program.
Yes.
I did the math here. That's the only reason I know it. All right, thanks very much.
Yeah, no problem. So let's take a look at some of the data. So this is how the money was spent over the past 2 years. Now, 2 years ago, 94% of that funding went to staffing. And the reality is most of it does go to pay for K-3 teachers, K-3 paras. If there is an instructional coach or a literacy coach on a campus, it is pretty much going to be paid for by Move On When Reading. And we saw a little bit of a change last year. So if you'll notice, it went from 94% 2 years ago to 82%. That's actually the result of another change that was proposed and enacted by this subcommittee, which deals with the Every Student Succeeds Act. And I'm going to talk about that in about one slide, I think. So there was a little bit of a change in there. And that takes us to some of the programmatic requirements for Move On When Reading. So one of the things we're responsible for, one of the things the legislation calls for, is that every school have a core reading program for its K-3 students. And that program needs to address the pillars of early literacy. So it has to start with phonological awareness, has to lead into phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. And so that is actually in the legislation. That is called for by the legislation itself. Last year, the legislation called for the core reading program to be scientifically based. And one of the changes proposed by this committee to align with the Every Student Succeeds Act is that the core reading programs and the intervention programs actually transition to being evidence-based. And so, just as a quick reminder, ESSA has 4 evidence levels. The lowest level would be the demonstrates a rationale level. And that's where no experimental study has occurred to vet that particular program. It's more correlational. The top 3 levels all have some sort of randomized control study where they can vet that the program is effective. I realize that most of you are very familiar with ESSA. Would you like me to go into ESSA a little bit, Chairperson Clark, or do you feel like that's something that maybe doesn't need as much attention?
Is everybody pretty comfortable with that? Doesn't need a deeper dive into ESSA or would like it? I'm looking at the committee members. No. I think we're okay.
Okay, great.
I'm reading the room.
So that was one of the big changes made by this committee. And it was an important change because it aligned the Move On When Reading legislation with ESSA. And actually, this has become a really big component of our work. We thankfully have a lot of support at the department. We received some excellent training through WestEd on the Every Student Succeeds Act, on the levels of evidence. And actually, we have become, as a team, a sort of mini What Works clearinghouse where we are vetting actually every core reading program in use in the state we have vetted, and then we are actually in the process of vetting every intervention program as well. So that's been an interesting new layer to our work that's really kind of opened our eyes to what's out there. So one of the other big programmatic requirements for Move On When Reading is an assessment system. It's a comprehensive assessment system that calls for a universal screener, diagnostics, progress monitor, benchmark, and summative assessments. One of the changes called for by this committee when it last met was that when schools submit their triannual literacy data, they'll actually provide a narrative where they analyze that data. They analyze what the data are telling them and then what they are going to do with it moving forward. And I'd really like to share this graphic in particular because I think this is this is kind of the beating heart of Move On When Reading. When I think of Move On When Reading, when I think of what we do each day, it's that idea that the second that kiddo walks into kindergarten, he or she is screened to see if he or she is struggling. Now, obviously not with reading at kindergarten, it would be phonological awareness, but K through 3, they're screened within the first 2 to 4 weeks of school. if that student is identified as a struggling reader, then he immediately should be receiving a diagnostic assessment, which is a brief assessment to tell the specific area of struggle. Keep in mind, universal screeners just say, hey, this student might struggle with reading. The diagnostic says, and in fact, it's an issue with phonological awareness, so that schools can target their intervention.
Sean, thank you. I have to admit something to the rest of my colleagues here. First of all, I am not an educator, so if I've asked some stupid questions, please bear with me as I try and keep up.
No problem.
So the benchmarks or assessments that schools are using from K-3, is there a requirement that requires they use the same tool over the same period of time so that there's continuity over time?
So there's not a requirement. Now, I will say that the data that we collect shows that most schools, and I think this is a financial issue as well as maybe a philosophical one, the assessment they purchase, they do use K-3. So, and actually in a second, no, actually I didn't bring that data. For example, DIBELS is used by 74% of the state as its universal screener, as its progress monitor. And so you do tend to see some consistency. Now, there is a change quite frequently at third grade, because the standards change pretty significantly in that moment. K2, the standards are really focused on building those foundational skills of reading, as some of you know, because you were part of that process. They build on, phonological awareness, again, the oral vocabulary, all the way up through the skills of decoding. At third grade, they really do get more comprehension heavy. So a number of schools choose to adopt an assessment at third grade, such as Galileo or NWEA MAP, that assesses comprehension a little bit more heavily. So that's where you kind of sometimes tend to see the change.
Thank you.
So kind of back to this system. Again, the kiddo is screened. We get a diagnostic. We know exactly what he's struggling with. He receives targeted intervention. The parents are notified. We get progress monitoring to see how that kid's doing. If they're doing well, then they're moved sort of out of that intervention, or the intervention is changed or modified as needed. And then they take a benchmark assessment along with most of their peers to see where they stand in relation to their peers. And then, of course, there's the summative assessment, which is that end of year or end of course exam. Currently, that would be AZ merit for third grade. And so this is required by the Move On When Reading legislation. And it's so important because, it's the heart of that early identification and targeted intervention. And this is just an example of actually the narratives that we receive with literacy data. I've obviously obfuscated the schools so that the information is private, but it's pretty interesting. It talks about how this school in particular, or these schools I should say, in analyzing their data, they noticed that there was a need to increase their instruction in phonological awareness, particularly at the kindergarten level. I would actually make that suggestion for the entire state, but they really did zero in on what was needed and what they're going to do as a result. And I think this is actually what the intent of this committee was when they enacted this suggestion, this change. So I was pretty excited to share this with you. One of the other changes called for was a greater specificity in parent contact. So the law has always required 2 contacts with parents each year. There's a general letter that goes out to every K-3 family at the start of the year. Talks about the Move On When Reading legislation, kind of tells about the possibility of retention at third grade, talks about the good cause exemptions, which I'll cover in just a moment. And there's a second letter that is to be sent the minute a student is identified as at risk. And that letter, to be honest with you, prior to last year, had some key information, but the legislation was a little ambiguous about what can be included. So this subcommittee made some very specific suggestions, and now that letter actually contains all of that information. So tells that parent that the student is struggling, says what his specific area of struggle is, says what the school is doing to help him overcome that struggle, talks about supplemental programs available at the school. I love that addition in particular because that's something that schools don't often think to add. And then includes instructions on what parents can do at home to help their student overcome their struggles as well. So it really nicely involves the parents. Now we recommend, it's not required by legislation, we recommend a third letter. The second a student is really on the radar for possible retention, we recommend schools notify parents immediately so that just never comes as a surprise. Oh, sorry. And actually, here's an example. We have 2 sample letters on our website that schools, most schools in the state actually download and modify as needed. We have them in English and in Spanish. And as you can see, talks about like the student's specific area of struggle, talks about what the school is doing to assist that student. And again, it ties really nicely back to that assessment system. It really reinforces that expectation of the legislation. So Move On When Reading, of course, gets most headlines for retention. And there was a very important change made by this committee, called for by this committee, that deals with retention. So as you all know, a student who fails to meet the Move On When Reading cut score on the reading portion of the third grade English AZ Merit exam is a candidate for retention unless she meets one of 4 good cause exemptions. Now, I want to kind of explain something quickly, and I'm going to get really technical. You can tell I'm an educator. So my arm is going to be a bar. So I had a slide on this, but I cut it for time, and then I realized by cutting it, I was going to now have to do my arm example, so I apologize. So my arm is a bar, and this bar is actually the entire range of minimally proficient on AZ Merit. So this is the lowest score you can possibly get. This is the highest you can get while still being minimally proficient. So what a lot of people don't understand is that whole range is not what triggers retention. There is actually a cut score embedded about halfway through. It's a little less than halfway through. It's the Move On When Reading cut score. And students who fail to meet that cut score are then candidates for retention. So you can absolutely have students who score in the minimally proficient range who also meet the Move On When Reading cut score and then are not candidates for retention. Member Wilbur?
Sean, this is something that I've been trying to pursue for a while now. You've probably been seeing my emails. I apologize.
No.
So if you look at last year's data on how many kids were in the minimally proficient category on ELA, third graders, and there was 44%. So that's 44% of about 88,000 third graders. So it's about 38,720 kids in that bar,
in the
right?
bar.
And if you said that cut score is about halfway between, which it is, it's 2450, you would assume that you'd almost have half of your kids below. Yeah, I mean, if it was a perfect normal curve. But it's not, because we know it goes like this, right?
Yeah.
So, but I'm still wondering about that 2450 because it only affected 1,744 kids. So that would almost say you'd almost have a straight line of kids below 2450, and the other 95% of the kids are above. I don't know, should we ask to see that data? Because I'm curious about how that can happen, because you can have kids that can pass the ELA and not pass the cut score.
Yeah, you can, because the cut score, again, is determined solely by the reading portion of the exam. I'm going to explain it, and this is just full disclosure. I'm not a psychometrician, so this isn't my area of expertise, but I've worked with our psychometrician, Lee Scott, at ADE, and she's given me some verbiage that we use with the field, and I don't know if this is going to be a satisfactory answer, and if it's not, we can obviously totally pursue a better one. But what she's told us, and this is what we relate back to the field, is that the questions that deal with reading on the third grade exam, they're separated out from the rest of the ELA exam, and each one is assigned a p-value. It's assigned an individual value that then takes the collection of reading questions and equates it to like a 100% range. It almost becomes its own little mini exam embedded within the larger exam. And then for Move On When Reading purposes, that is the only thing that counts towards retention. So we actually do get some strange circumstances where a school will call us and they'll say, hey, I've got 2 kids in the minimally proficient range. One has a lower score than the other, but the one with the higher score actually failed to meet the Move On When Reading cut score. So we talked to them a lot about, well, that's because they struggled on the reading portion versus other parts of the ELA exam. So I know that isn't the best answer. That's just full disclosure. It's kind of the extent of my knowledge with psychometrics, but I think it's something, Dr. Cruz, that maybe we could talk about.
We could certainly have somebody here from that department, from the assessment department, at our next meeting to address that very issue, if you would like.
Yeah, that'd be helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, and actually, it's helpful for us as well. We get some good verbiage.
Well, I'd just like to see what that curve looks like. Do you really have
Can
only
you see if they
1,700
could
kids
provide
out of 38,000?
the data behind that
Yeah,
so we could see
absolutely.
the actual curve? That would be great.
Yeah, thank you.
So one of the changes that arose when it comes to retention is there had been 3 good cause exemptions, and there really was a need for a 4th. I think everybody involved with this legislation was really uncomfortable with the idea that a single data point would determine retention for a student. In fact, we were the only state in the country where a single data point could do that. So one of the changes recommended by this committee was a new exemption. And I'm actually going to walk through all 4 just as a refresher. So the first one is for English language learners who have less than 2 years of ELL instruction. Second one is for a student who's in the process of a special education referral or has a significant reading impairment, including dyslexia. Dyslexia verbiage was added in 2015, which was fantastic. The previously final one was a student who has an identified disability and has an IEP, and the IEP team, including parents, agree that promotion is appropriate. And that was it. Those were the 3 good cause exemptions. And so this committee suggested what we actually now colloquially refer to as the 1 bad day exemption. We would get calls about this all the time. I have a student, all year her data has shown that she's reading at a proficient level. She got to AZ Merit, she panicked, and then completely bombed the exam and failed. And so now we have this new exemption where a school can actually exempt a student from retention using data from a valid literacy assessment from over the course of the year to show that that student is making sufficient progress towards reading. We've actually also defined what makes a valid literacy assessment. We have a guidance document on our website, and we have a video. I apologize, you have to listen to my voice if you watch it, but we have a video on there as well to help schools navigate how to use that expectation, how to navigate that expectation. And a couple more changes. So if a student is retained, if a student is held back in 3rd grade, then there were 4 requirements in legislation on the left, and 2 of those were modified by this subcommittee. So one of the suggestions used to be assignment to a new teacher. That's now been fleshed out to assignment to a new teacher who was designated in the top performance classification on the most recent evaluation. Obviously, that can be a real challenge for schools in rural areas where there's just a single 3rd grade teacher. So the schools have the option to use more than one of these strategies. They're not limited to using all of them because that one might not be available. There was one that called for online reading instruction, and this was, I love this change. It changed to student receives small group reading instruction led by a teacher, which may include an online component. So putting the emphasis back on teaching, putting the emphasis back on instruction, especially small group instruction. And then, of course, summer school and intensive instruction before, during, or after school remain the same. And again, one of the changes was the legislation used to say that schools were required to use one of these, and now it's more than one. And then just a couple, oh yeah.
Chair Clark, may I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Sean, can you, this is just for my personal knowledge, so does the department collect, if a student, let me backtrack, if the school is notifying parents that the student may be held back once they reach 3rd grade, and let's say the student is in 1st grade, does the department collect data on students who are held back prior to 3rd grade because of their reading ability, right? So when I was an administrator, there was the thought that it would be more appropriate to hold a 1st grader back than a 3rd grader back. And so at the school, we would make those recommendations to the parents, and we may hold them back in kinder. Maybe they did kinder twice or 1st grade twice. Do you collect that type of data?
We don't through Move On when every other year. So next school year, for example, so this school year, LEAs with letter grades of C, D, or F are submitting. In fact, the deadline for submission of literacy plans and data is today. And so Sarah and I have about 50 emails and about 40 phone messages waiting for us when we get back. The LEA letter grades were not available this year. And we talked as a department and sort of ran that up and took a look at what are the strategies we can implement because there weren't current LEA letter grades. And the decision was made that the legislation calls for LEA letter grades, so we used the most recent, which unfortunately were 2014. So the data is 4 years old. However, and I'm pretty proud of this, my team, we've worked really hard to build relationships in the field. We've worked really, really hard to be a very positive face of this program. And we thought when we made this announcement, there was going to be an uproar. And really, it was just a couple inquisitive emails, and people are like, you know what, we trust you, we get it, here's our plan. So I'm really excited about that. The cut score for AZ Merit, as a reminder, the great armbar example, the cut score is actually the lowest in the country for a state that has K-3 reading legislation, and it's the lowest by far. The ADE Maurer team, a Move On When Reading team, there's just 2 of us, so it's me, and actually this would be a good moment to introduce my colleague. So this is Sarah Bondi. She is our K-3 early literacy specialist. She's from the Peoria district, and she's been with us about 6 months. Oh, gosh. Time goes much differently at AD. 6 months translates a little differently, but thankfully Sarah is here. So we're the entirety of the Move On When Reading team. I'm also the English Language Arts Director for the state, so we're about a 1.5 team. That's the smallest such team in the country for legislation of this type. And then just a reminder, the budget for Move On When Reading, when the program was housed by the state board, it was $1.5 million. When it transferred over to the department, it was $500,000. So our overhead costs, we get $500,000 for administrative costs. But actually what a lot of people don't know is that also includes all of our professional development. So we offer this amazing training called Teaching Reading Effectively. It's a 5-day training that takes you through the pillars of early literacy, teaches you the science of reading, and we charge $60 for it. It's unbelievable. It would be about $4,000 through a private vendor. And all of our ability to provide that training comes out of that same budget. So I think it's always worth mentioning.
Madam Chair, I have another question.
Sure.
Yeah.
Can you share with us a little bit more about why the budget was cut 2/3? And is it possible to find out other states how much they spend and how much staff they have in a relational per student basis so that we can get some scope of what the rest of the world does versus what Arizona does?
Yeah, Member Wellborn, that is very possible. So I worked closely with a national group, Excel in Ed. They have that data available, the average size of a team, the average overhead budget. The example I always give, because it gives me hope but also makes me cry, is that in Mississippi, they have a staff of 13 to 15. They have, I think it's $5 million for administrative costs, but they also employ what they call a swarm technique. They actually employ 100 literacy coaches through their department that they deploy into schools that need assistance. It's amazing, and they've had great results from it. So there are a plethora of models out there. I'd recommend looking at Mississippi, Florida in particular. But yes, that is data that we can very easily obtain.
Chair Clark, may I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Sean, there was some discussion, I believe, last October. We had some issues with certain schools meeting the statutory deadline for October 1st for their literacy plan. And it was brought up to the board, I think, in a presentation that the board may want to put something within that statute to ensure that schools are submitting by October 1st. I would suggest that it could be the purview of this committee to recommend any statutory language changes in that regard so that the board has more specifically outlined authority in that regard. So I know that the MOER plan or the literacy plans are due today. Mm-hmm. Do you think maybe Dr. Cruz or Sean, at that October 24th meeting of this committee, just let us know, like, of
percentages?
Of 160 schools that needed to submit this year, we have 80.
Absolutely.
We can bring that data.
Oh, absolutely.
Perfect. Thank you.
And actually, thank you, Alicia. I'm glad you brought that up because currently we don't have any sort of follow through when a school doesn't submit, and so that is something that definitely we would need clarified. I do want to say though, one of the things that we've done the last 2 years is we partner with the state charter board. We've made really good friends with them, and so when a deadline has passed and a charter in particular has not submitted, they work with us. We notify the school. And just to say this, by the time a deadline has arrived and a school has not submitted, we have been in contact, probably 25 times. We've called, we've emailed. We really do our due diligence because we always say this, we're not in the business of denying money to kids. So we want them to get their money, so we really do try. But if they're non-responsive, we call our friends at the charter board. We send another letter saying, hey, do you need any help? You've missed the deadline. And we CC the charter board on it. And we usually get a response within 8 minutes. So we've had a lot less of an issue with charters. We do still have some districts that struggle to meet the deadlines, but it's a much smaller number. So I'm very thankful for that partnership.
Sean, clarification: their K-3 money is not released, correct?
Until
their plan has been received and approved.
That's only for C, D, and F. Schools with letter grades of C, D, or F, their funding is not released until their plan is submitted and approved. But actually, for LEAs with letter grades of A or B, during years like this year, it's auto-released because they're not required to submit. But actually, next year, it's going to be released as well. And so we actually don't have much sway with those schools if they choose not to submit, though I will say all but 4 LEAs submitted last year. So it's remarkable. And out of almost 500 LEAs, we had all but 4. And actually one of those came back later and submitted, and we were able to get them their funding. So that was pretty exciting. So again, we are a small but mighty team. I like to say that it's just 2 of us, but we really move mountains. And if you have any questions for us, we're happy to gather data for you. We are happy to discuss any issues or questions that you may have. Sarah and I, in addition to managing the legislation, we provide technical assistance to all the schools. We help vet core reading programs under ESSA. We do a lot of work for Move On When Reading. We're very proud of the work we've done. And we're pretty excited about the possibilities of the subcommittee because the last time you guys met, you made excellent changes that really helped improve the program. So thank you for that.
Hey, Sean.
Yeah.
One last question before we let you go. On the vetting of core reading programs, do you have any data on what some of the issues or challenges, struggles, if they're, as you're going through that vetting process, that you could share with us maybe for the next meeting?
Yeah, I can pull some data for you. I can absolutely show you the core reading programs that are used most frequently around the state.
Right, I think we know those. I'm just wondering if for those that are maybe you're finding like there's an issue, can you help us understand what those issues might be? I think that's what I'm looking for.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Is that okay?
So any questions on Move On When Reading?
I think we have.
I just wanted to thank Sean and Sarah for being here today. And just for the committee's benefit, I wanted to just give them a shout out just because they did their very first ever Move On When Reading convening this last summer. And they had over 60 LEAs take advantage of that. So they came in really from all over the state. It's a nice mix of charter and district. Mm-hmm. And they provided some really nice, rich professional development. We did it in partnership with West Ed. And then they actually said, get your computers out in the afternoon. We're going to work on your plan right now. So they got them started and got them revved up. And so I just thought it was really well done.
Thank you. Thank you. And actually every school that attended that submitted their plan on time. So I'm particularly happy about that.
So it had the desired result. That's excellent.
So thank you. Yes. Again, if you have any questions, if any arise as you move forward, Sarah and I are absolutely here, and we're happy to help.
Thank you, Sean.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you. All right, we're moving on to the next item on the agenda, which is to have a presentation and discussion on some analysis that was done on Move On When Reading plans. We have a virtual speaker and presenter, and I just thought I'd introduce Robert. Are you there? Can you hear us?
I'm here.
Yay. Yeah. So Robert Badgley is I've worked with Rob before and asked him to take on this project, and so we wanted to share with you some of the results, but I wanted to give you a little bit of his background. So he is a research associate at the Center for Applied Research and Educational Improvement at the University of Minnesota. Prior to that, he was a senior policy analyst at Morrison Institute for Public Policy at ASU. He has a PhD in educational policy and evaluation from the Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College at Arizona State University. So I'm going to let you take it away, Rob.
Sure, thanks, Terry. Can you see me? Am I coming?
We can see you.
We can see you.
There you go.
When he talks, it will.
It gets big when he talks.
Oh, okay. When you talk, we see you. When you don't talk,
You're in a box.
and then you'll go to your slides and we won't see you, I think.
Correct. All right, so you can see my slides?
Yep.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Terry. As Terry mentioned, my name is Rob Boggy. I did this work in partnership with Read On Arizona as well as ADE. As Terry mentioned, I'm a researcher at the University of Minnesota, although I did spend several years in Arizona. And I always like to point out that before I did this, I was a public school teacher for 6 years. And I have a real heart for Arizona, a real heart for kids. And so whenever I get a chance to share some of the work I do now with folks who are working hard to help kids, it's always a pleasure. So I know that everyone's time is valuable. I will try to walk you through the findings of this analysis as quickly as I can and hopefully have time for questions at the end. As I mentioned, this work is a collaboration between Read On and the Arizona Department of Education itself. Our main goal was to better understand how Move On interventions are related to third grade. So these analyses came to the specifically from the literacy plans that we've been discussing. And related to the literacy plans, we were interested in two specific research questions, although we did address the second again. The first research question was, are specific core literacy programs associated with higher rates of third grade reading achievement? Our second question then was, are specific universal screening tools associated with higher rates of third grade reading achievement? And I think Sean did a great job of laying out what these are, but just as a reiteration, core literacy programs are general programs.
Hey, Rob, sorry to interrupt you. Can you do your slides as a slideshow?
As a slideshow.
So see that tab in the orange bar. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like 6 over. Says slideshow.
Oh, it is in slideshow mode on my screen.
Ah.
So let me see. Let's see what we can do here. Hang on. I'm going to try something different.
This is our first time using Google Hangouts, folks, so bear with us.
There it is.
Okay. We should be able to see everything.
We can see. Oh, there we go.
There
You got it.
Great.
Thank
All
you.
right, cool. So yeah, core literacy programs. They're sort of the general program that's used school-wide. If you're working through response to intervention or multi-tiered systems of support framework, this is your Tier 1 program. And then universal screening tools, as Sean mentioned, are used to identify students who are at high risk of not being able to read proficiently by the end of third grade. And then the last question that we looked at was, to what extent are school and district characteristics associated with different rates of third grade reading achievement? And while these data didn't come specifically from literacy plans, they bear heavily on the questions that we're trying to answer, and so we thought they were relevant to this set of analyses. And so just as a bit of background, our data were at the school level. So we had information on students who were aggregated for each school in the state. And we used the 2015-2016 school year. And that was the most recent year for which all of the literacy plan data have been reported for all schools. We could only include schools with complete data, which isn't a huge limitation, but what it did is it sort of shifted the population of schools that we can generalize to, and we can discuss that later. But just sort of as a matter of due diligence, just know that we could only analyze schools for which we had all the data available. Our main outcome was the percentage of students passing third grade AZ Merit English Language Arts. And also, I think as it relates particularly to the purposes of Move On When Reading, the percentage of students of Performance Level 1 on the third grade AZ Merit ELA. For anyone who's not familiar, Performance Level 1 is sort of the lowest achievement level on that assessment. So our final sample included 953 schools, so again, a very large sample there. And we examined differences using two sets of analyses. So one way to do this would be to look at differences in achievement, just sort of the face value. Are there differences or are there not? But that a lot of times that'll sort of leave the question, well, what if something else was driving that relationship that we didn't account for? For instance, if schools that serve lots of students who live in poverty use a certain kind of screening assessment as opposed to those who don't, and we see that that school or those schools have lower achievement, we'd want to know if that was also somehow related to poverty. And so we ran a second set of analyses that controlled for a variety of school characteristics, and I'll outline those. So for question one, we asked, our specific core literacy programs associated with higher rates of third grade literacy. So as Sean mentioned, schools are free to choose the core literacy program that best meets their needs. That said, in the data, there were more programs than we could meaningfully analyze, so we chose to limit the analysis to programs that were used by 5% or more of schools. And that was Houghton Mifflin Reading, Journeys, Reading Street, Storytown, Treasures, and Trophies. And in these analyses, what we were looking at is whether or not there were differences between schools that used these programs and schools that didn't. I should also point out that schools can use multiple programs. And so we also ran another analysis looking at whether or not the number of programs that a school used was related to their overall literacy rates. And so the thinking behind that would be if a school, used more programs than, say, a school that used, a single program, that might represent sort of a sensitivity towards addressing multiple needs, and they might have higher rates of reading achievement. It could also, in some ways, dilute the sort of instructional focus, and in that way, you might expect lower achievement. So we just thought that would be an important thing to look at as well. And this may sound initially like a very unexciting finding, but when we get to the discussion, you'll see that I think it has some meaningful implications. But we didn't find any statistically significant differences between schools that used each of the core literacy programs and those that didn't. And we also didn't find any relationship between the number of core literacy programs and the percentage of students passing or at performance level 1. And so with question 2, we took a similar approach, except this time we focused on universal screeners, right, which are those tools that we use to identify students who are at especially high risk of not reading proficiently at the end of the year. Again, schools can use any program so long as it is evidence-based, and there were many, many programs. So we limited it to programs that were used by 5% or more schools. Those were AIMSweb, Dibbles Next, and Galileo. And similar to the last analysis, we also looked at the number of screening tools that a school used. For these analyses, because universal screeners are focused on the lowest performing students, or the students at the highest risk of failure, we only examined the percent of students who are at performance level 1 as the outcome. And with the last analysis, we didn't see any significant differences between programs or between universal screeners. And we didn't see any relationship between the number of screening tools used and the percentage of students at performance level 1. And then our final question, which again didn't come directly from the literacy plan data, but I think bears significantly on the issue that we're trying to get at here, is to what extent are school and district characteristics associated with different rates of third grade literacy? And so specifically the things we looked at were whether or not a school is a charter school, a school and district level enrollment, school and district level percent free and reduced learning, school and district percent minority enrollment, and whether or not a school was located in a rural area. And in these analyses, just to give you a bit of background, what we did is we included all of these characteristics in the same analysis. And what that does is it gives you relationships that are independent of everything else in that analysis. And so one of the common challenges with these sort of contextual issues, right, when you're trying to parse out what might be driving lower achievement at a school, I think research has shown across the board, in fact, I know research has shown across the board, that, poorer students tend to, on average, perform lower than their affluent peers. And at the same time, these schools tend to have higher rates of minority students. And so it can disentangle what might be driving these different relationships. And so in the analysis we conducted, the idea is that we remove all of that shared relationship, and we can have greater confidence that the relationships we see are sort of related to or in a causal way of thinking, which again, we're not doing a causal analysis, and I'll reiterate that later. But if these were to be driving the outcomes we're seeing, we have greater confidence that it's that specific characteristic of the school as opposed to something else. And so in these analyses, we looked at both percent passing and the percent at performance level 1. And we did find several statistically significant relationships. And so what we see is that school level percent free and reduced price lunch is significantly related to student achievement at the school level. Again, independent of all the other factors, a 10 percentage point increase in school FRL was associated with an average 2 percentage point decrease in the number of students passing AZ merit, and a 2 percentage point increase in the number of students at performance level 1. We also saw that independent of poverty, school level percent minority enrollment was associated with rates. And this effect was actually larger than that of poverty. And we saw that a 10 percentage point increase in minority enrollment was associated with a 4 percentage point decrease in the number of students passing AZ merit, and a 4 percentage point increase in the number of students at performance level 1. We also saw an interesting relationship in district level percent minority enrollment and achievement. This was unexpected and is a little bit complicated, so I present it with some caution. But independent of things like school level percent minority and school level percent poverty and district level percent poverty, we saw a 10 percentage point increase in minority enrollment was associated with a 2 percentage point increase in the number of students passing AZ merit at the school level. So again, that was sort of in the opposite direction that we had expected. But interesting and certainly something worth looking further into.
Rob?
Yes.
Do you know how many students fell into the top statistically significant, the FRL, and also were a member of the percent minority enrollment group? How many unique students were in both of those buckets?
I don't know that offhand, but in these analyses, it's not really that we don't really fall into buckets as much as just sort of an overall relationship that's independent. Terry and I could definitely talk about going back and parsing some of that information out. But even if we did with the data we had, because it was school level data, it would be very hard to know what bucket specific kids fell into if it wasn't already reported at the school level.
Maybe just at the same school, because my inference would be that you would find some of the same kids in both.
Yeah, I'm sure. In fact, many. Well, Terry and I can maybe discuss going back and looking at some of that data. It's not in what we have now, though.
Thank you.
May I interrupt and ask a question as well, Rob?
Mm-hmm. Sure.
So I'm assuming, or I'm hoping that within these 953 schools that we have some outliers out there that are bucking the trend in terms of their achievement or improvement in reading skills. Is there a way to look at perhaps the group of high minority schools and analyze if they are doing anything in common to achieve their goals? Or is there a way to look at rural schools that are achieving high rates, either in terms of how much they're improving reading rates or the proficiency levels or percentage of kids that are reaching proficiency levels, so that you can sort of look at it backwards and try and identify if there's any characteristics we can learn from?
Sean, I was going to ask you to speak to that a little.
Sure. Member Wellborn, that's a great question, and actually I'm very excited to answer it. So the Move On When Reading team is working in conjunction with Read On Arizona, and we've run the data and we've identified schools in rural, suburban, urban, and town parts of the state in multiple counties that are bucking the trend, that are in pockets where their compatriots are not doing as well, but they're having, currently we looked at trend data, so it was 4 years of improvement on AZ merit. I know we're also looking at it a little differently to look at percent improvement from 2015 to 2018. And actually the goal of that is that Chairperson Clark and Sarah and I are actually going to contact those schools. We're going to go out and interview them, and we're going to do some success analytics projects where we highlight those schools, what it is they're doing differently, really celebrate what they're doing in a very public and positive manner, and also just try to build networks amongst those communities using, Terry's ability as a head of Read-On to build some of those networks, so that those schools in those areas that aren't doing as well can look at their colleagues and say, hey, what can we go? It's the old saying, right? Bad teachers borrow, good teachers steal, so that they can look at what their peers are doing and do it as well.
That sounds awesome. So what's your timeline of when you'll know how many schools that are in that bucket?
We know the list of schools that are, we have sort of done that analysis, and now we're in the process of reaching out to those that will either agree to be part of that case study process. I did just make a note that we've done it by free and reduced lunch and some other subgroups,
yes.
but that we might want to tag back to Member Wellboard's question and Rob's work and look at some of the other subgroups. So we'll make a note on that.
That's awesome.
So we're trying to do it and push it, and we were hoping to have something before the last meeting of this group.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It may be in draft form, it may be preliminary analysis or to share, but that's what our hope is. That's okay.
Thank you.
Continue, Rob, sorry.
Oh, no worries. I actually really love that idea. I'm kind of sad I'm not in Arizona to be a part of that. That's a really cool project. That's the in terms of district level minority enrollment, saw the relationship that was surprising. But the last component, which I think is especially relevant for some of the things that Arizona may have unique, that or some of the things that are unique to Arizona, was that rural schools, even after accounting for poverty and other school demographics, rural schools on average perform lower than non-rural schools. And so, what do we do with that? I think it's important to note that even the relationships that we saw, or the relationships we were looking to see, because of the nature of the analysis, it is correlational, not necessarily causal. That said, there's, we can always use our intuition to lead us towards some deeper analyses to see what are causing some of these relationships. In terms of the first two questions, I think it's important to point out that non-significant relationships don't necessarily mean programs aren't helping kids. It just means that we didn't see any evidence that a specific program offers an advantage over another. With regard to sort of the school contextual factors, we saw that poverty and minority enrollment are associated with lower rates of achievement independent of each other. With regard to poverty, it's a universal issue of education, but poverty presents many challenges that, of course, those of us who've been in education are always trying to turn the narrative on. With regard to minority enrollment, I think that there's certainly something there to be looked at in terms of the changing demographics of the state, the cultural needs of students, particularly as the demographic composition of the state is increasingly towards students who are non-white. Again, the district level minority enrollment would be something that's worth looking at a little bit further. And rural schools, again, are an area that I think are worth spending a little bit of time thinking about, because there are many challenges in rural communities, like poverty and other demographic issues. But I think with this analysis, the rural schools might be struggling with things that are unique specifically to their rural nature. That those are things that are worth addressing, particularly at a systemic level. And just as a final note, we had planned on analyzing all of the literacy plan data, but as we started to dig into it, we realized that there were just some data quality issues that needed to be accounted for. Sean and Terry and I have worked on this a good bit, and they're doing great work to make sure that sort of the next iteration is usable and of a high quality. But just know that we were initially planning on going further into these data, but we just... So with that, I'll ask if you have any questions, and I will go back to my screen if I can.
Rob, this is Terry. Just again, thank you, one, for making yourself available today to do this virtually. We really appreciate it. And thank you for your work on this. I didn't share with the group that this was actually done pro bono, and while he was in transition from ASU to his new job. So this was out of the passion that he has for helping us figure out what works for Arizona kids. And we just appreciate that you were willing to do that. And where we can, we'd love for you to continue to be involved in helping us think through the research and questions that we have to get better outcomes. So thank you. Anyone have any other questions for Rob before we let him go?
I'd just like to add my thanks. This is Patricia Wellborn. Thanks, Rob. We really appreciate your help.
Sure. Well, thank you. And, when I was in Arizona, I would always tell folks that if you wanted to connect with someone who was going to do good for kids, connect with Terry. So, money with being chairwoman gets you a raise, but it should. She's awesome.
All right. Well, I think we can let you exit your Google Hangout now. So thank you, Rob. Thanks again. And I should also let the committee know that we are going to get Alicia the final full report so that this group will actually have that for your packets, and that we'll follow up with that later this week.
Madam Chair, can I would really like to see if we can get some kind of data or report that would spell out what I think occurs, and that would be to fully demonstrate the relationship between FRL, per student funding at schools, and what their reading rates are. Because the hypothesis is that there's a direct connection, and that schools that have more funds available are able to achieve higher rates of reading than schools that have less funds. And it sounds to me like we might also want to try and do the same for rural versus non-rural schools. So I'd like to make a request to Ms. Williams or your team, whomever can help us. Is that possible to get that?
Chairwoman Clark, Member Wellborn, staff will work to see what we can do with this. I won't say no, but I'm not saying yes. I'm saying we will work hard on this to get this to this committee. But I do want to clarify, when you talk about FRL and per pupil funding, are you talking about what Sean Ross was talking when you look at the 145 per K-12 student with just mower money?
No, if you
funding for
the total funding. So if you look on the auditor's report, the financial reports, that they actually provide per student funding, and it's an average of their total budget divided by their student ADM. So that'll give you your per student funding. And then the state board also has the FRL numbers. I don't know if they have rural. And then we have reading rates. So anybody who's a whiz on Excel should be able to do that in there. Yeah, so.
And you would want to include federal funds with that, I would imagine.
Mm-hmm. Oh, so those report only has state funds, the state money?
Well, if you're going to look at all in, you want to look at FRL, then you need to also include federal funding.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Chair Clark, Member Wellborn, we'll see what we can do.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, so we're moving on to the next item on our agenda, which is a presentation discussion on the information that was provided by the Education Commission of the States. Alicia, are you going to walk us through that?
Chairwoman Clark, I'm going to try. So just for some background for this committee, we reached out to Education Commission of the States to see if they could come and present some information on Move On When Reading and really what the national landscape looks like, including states that have mower policies, but maybe states that don't have mower policies but are moving the needle, right, for literacy. They were unavailable to come today, but they have said that they will make themselves available for a future meeting. So really today is just going through some of this information. If you have questions, I will take those questions and I will give them to my contact at ECS. And so hopefully when they come to our meeting on the 24th of October or whatnot, they can answer some of those things in more detail than I could. So does anyone have any questions about what they read? I know Member Wellborn has a slide that she put together that she wanted to discuss with the committee.
Yes, I do.
Why don't we, Chair Clark, is that okay if we start? Okay.
Okay, could you be my mouse for me, please?
Is your mouse not working?
Not
Is it on?
No, maybe not. Go ahead. There we go.
Oh, it's in here. So I will, Chair Clark, members of the committee, I will send this out to all of you so that you have what Member Wellborn put together.
So there was a link on this Education Commission report. Thank you. And the link went to the Annie Casey Foundation, which has the Kids Count database, and a lot of it, I think it's mostly NAEP data that they use. And so most of this is really from the Annie Casey Foundation website, and I just added 2 columns to the right, the green and the pink, to look at who are those in the below basic category who made the most improvements. Because I really thought that this is where we want to start focusing on learning from others how they achieved that. So this spreadsheet is just a little math thing. So we'll send you a copy of it, but what it shows is that if you look at the 5-year look back, which is the pink category, the biggest growth was in California with 3%, District of Columbia with 6%, Mississippi with 7%, New Jersey with 3%, and South Dakota with 3%. So I'd be really interested we could find out what they did from a policy and a statewide level, and also sort of what they did at their administrative level to help accomplish those. And then I looked at the 10-year. I don't know that the 10-year look back is as relevant because the states didn't implement their reading programs as long. Most of them didn't implement them that long ago. There was a few. I think Florida was the outlier. Maybe, Sean, you know more than I do. But some of these other ones, the results in the last 5 years are more remarkable than they are what happened from 10 years.
So Florida has the oldest K-3 reading legislation program. I think it originated in 2001.
Yeah.
North Carolina came along in, I think, 2004. And then I think we actually, in 2010, but 2013 was the first year it was enacted,
right.
We're the third most tenured state
right.
with move on when reading legislation.
Right. So under the 10-year, Arizona actually had a 5-year gain, but a lot of that gain was achieved in the first part. So we only had, in the last 5 years, we've only had a 1% gain. So we haven't had as much gain as we had before we put in Mauer. How about that? And California has done well. And let's see what else. District of Columbia, over 10 years, they've had a 17% gain, which is pretty remarkable. And Florida had some really remarkable gains in the first 6 years of its program, and then it's kind of flattened out. I'm not sure what happened there.
So I can address that.
Okay.
Member Wellborn. Florida, again, because they implemented back in 2001, the most significant spike in their gains occurred within like the first, I think, 8 to 9 years of the program. They also did some modifications to their program. So when they first released it, any student who was in their level 1 component of their statewide exam was a candidate for retention. They sort of quickly backpedaled a little bit because that was a large number, though not too much. And what they saw was a spike in, initially, of course, in the number of students who were retained. But then over the course of, I think, again, 9 years, you saw a leveling out where the number of students who were retained settled down to about, I think it's a 13% average. It's around 10. But also, if you look at the number of their students who receive good cause exemptions, that rose as well, and that has leveled. So it's interesting to look at Florida's data because there's some trends in there that connect their good cause exemption spike to their retention decrease. It's interesting to examine. But Florida, again, has had the program for so many years. There has been a smoothing out.
And Sean, maybe while you're there, you can share with us. So you mentioned in your presentation that Arizona has the lowest bar in terms of retention. I'm not sure what it was, the cut score. But it's also the lowest bar in terms of the percent of kids that actually get retained. So there are ranges in other states when they hit that number. They were over 20% of the kids that were at risk of being retained, but with the exemptions, it came down. But there's some pretty high percentages out there.
Dr. Foley?
Question qualifier. I do believe, though, that many of those other states that had those retention had multiple assessments that were used, or other assessments. They tied the decision to retention with more than just one test. You know, one of the things that our panel
Dr. Foley, I need you to speak into the microphone, please. Sorry. Thank you.
Sorry. One of the things I think we talked an awful lot about is that being that our retention policy, and this was our conversation 2 years ago, being that our assessment is AZ merit, one of the challenges a lot of us from the field felt and were concerned about was again, having an assessment that would high stakes to an assessment that would be making a decision for a retention that didn't break down. We didn't have any idea how many items we're assessing, what part of the standard, or what, again, we're focusing on reading, which items or which part. I mean, it was sort of like a pregnancy test. Yes, no, but how many or how healthy or what area. We had an assessment that just said yes or no, retain or not retain. Right. And so that was one of the conversations that we had. A lot of these states have multiple other assessments that they use that give a lot more information other than a final decision, yes, no, for informing instruction. Now, of course, we have our screeners and we have our other pieces that tell us about the health and wellness of literacy development, but the actual assessment, the one that makes that decision is. We are one of the only ones that tie it to a test, and one that doesn't tell us a whole lot about informing what part or why.
Chairwoman Clark, member Dr. Foley, thank you for bringing that up. But I think one of the things that this committee will eventually have to discuss and talk about and give recommendations to the state board is that the State Board of Education voted in May to extend the AZ Merit contract for 1 year, and that contract would expire in November of 2019. So this current spring could potentially be the last year that our 3 through 8 students take the AZ Merit, with the menu of assessments being incorporated in school year 1920. The State Board of Education, in regard to move on when reading, is going to have to determine how all that's going to work together. Now, I'm not precluding the state legislator from making changes this next session, but we could give ideas. We could be, we as in the collective, we, you, the committee, the state board, the department, we could give ideas of options of how Move On When Reading can be incorporated with the menu of assessments. And we do have different options available, and I would always highly recommend that you always give options. You don't just say this one thing and that's it, because as Dr. Foley pointed out, there has been some discussion at the field level in regard to the data that is given at the end of that AZ Merit assessment, and is it usable for teachers to guide instruction. So that is in the purview of this committee, but there are additional steps that we also should look at when it comes to literacy, not just the end assessment or how we implement it, but really it's when you look at this Education Commission of the States, they bring it down to what other states are doing, how other states are finding successes. They talk about the supplemental instruction, they talk about the improvement plans, they talk about summer school. It's really taking a look of not just MOWER, but or Mauer. Sorry, I always say that one wrong. But really looking at a big picture of K-3 literacy and seeing what can move the needle.
I think going back to the very starting point of our presentation, the spirit of the legislation, I think one of the most powerful parts of the whole thing is not just the final test result, pass, not pass, but the whole process, the whole comprehensive best practices from the very, very, very beginning. And I think the legislation from the last time created some great opportunities to improve and to get better. And I think it would be worthwhile to take a look at some of these other programs and what are they doing and what does their whole package, not just their final test, look like. What does their whole package look like from
Supports and intervention.
Supports and intervention from early childhood and on. What does it look like? And are there parts and pieces that we could look at that would enhance or support what we already have done?
Dr. Cruz?
I just want to reiterate, from a policy perspective, we look at these numbers, and it doesn't tell the whole tale, as Alicia alluded to.
Of course not.
Right.
To me, it's just an indicator of something.
Indicator of something we should look at, and we know, for instance, Florida put billions with a B, into their K-3 reading alone, not even including early literacy. I'm looking at class size, looking at supports, looking at structured interventions across the state. So I would just ask this committee to keep those kinds of things in mind.
And it might be interesting also to look at some of them are a bit more prescriptive. And I think we can't ignore that.
Right. I just wanted to elaborate on what Alicia said, Ms. Williams said. At the July retreat that the state board had, there's a lot of discussion about this new menu of assessments, and the board is really struggling with how to continue with our responsibilities to enforce an A to F framework with the concept of menu of assessments. And right now, the menu of assessment legislation is not compatible with MAUR. So there has to be a change. So this is a perfect opportunity for this group to come up with some ideas and guide how that change is, how the legislation will be changed so that they're compatible. So it's very timely.
Yes. Chair Clark, Member Wellborn, I wouldn't be so strong in my language of not compatible. I would say that they could be compatible based upon how the board would set cut scores in accordance with the different options on the menu. That would be an option for the board. That if we have 5 menu options on the menu of assessments, and the board can set 5 cut scores for move on when reading.
Of course.
Right.
I'm just saying. Actually, the legislation calls for statewide assessments. In the future there will not be a single statewide assessment. So
Chairwoman Clark, Member Wellborn, that is correct.
Okay.
Chairwoman Clark, Member Wellborn, actually, if I could just add one item to that as well. One of the things to consider with these other states is that they don't have the statutory local control. So as an example, Nevada just adopted, I think it's Read on Nevada, 2 years ago, and this is the first year in which they're implementing their actual retention legislation. But as part of their rollout, they have a single universal screener that every school must use. They have a single core reading program. So there are some real differences when examining the data. There's some real differences in the way those programs are used or have rolled out. I do agree, though, that it's absolutely valuable to take a look at what other states are doing, and even knowing, honestly, just having dipped my toe in what some other states are doing. Yes, please, let's let's add that to what we're doing. I think it'd be fantastic. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you.
Anything over here? Questions?
Thank you for bringing that forward.
You're welcome. Anything else on that?
Chairwoman Clark, members of the committee, I think really with ECS and the presentation, there's a multitude of links in that document. So please feel free to share with your different constituency groups. So maybe the Nogales School District, or whatever your different whatever your different constituents are, share with them the information that you were presented today and get some of their feedback. Really, it's kind of just I guess I'm getting ahead of myself, so I'll wait until you call the next agenda item.
One thought that just occurred to me that maybe we could follow up with ECS, because I know you're going to have, and if no one likes this idea, fine. But could we pull out some of these that we're saying we see a growth there that we're interested in, and could they do a comparison, for example, from Mississippi, California, and like 2 others that this group agrees on, and really have them look at it from many aspects of local control to menu assessments, all of these things, so that we can almost do a real comparison. It's hard when you say one's done something in summer, one's done something in this. I don't know what else they have, so it's hard to have a full comprehensive picture.
There you
go. And what ECS might pull out might not be what Mississippi, for instance, is saying is really the driver for their growth. And so could that be possible, and would that help refine like what we're asking from them?
Absolutely.
Rather than them sort of giving us examples of things states are doing to really identify sort of factors that we want to look at and force. I just use 4 because you don't want to we have a limited time, but there seems to be kind of a natural grouping of other states that we're interested in. Does that sound like something that the group would find helpful?
Yes.
And how much it costs.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, I think at some point I'm rolling the movie forward, but there's
didn't happen.
There's going to be a difference between what we want and what we can afford.
Right.
But it doesn't mean you lose track of what you want.
Right. And what that costs to get that kind of outcome,
Right.
what costs come with that. Would that be, I think that might actually help them.
Sure.
And that is what they do.
Yep. Got it.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions that we didn't cover from the ECS information? And is there 2 other states that really rose to, those were just the ones that caught my eye. I think DC is interesting, but hard to kind of compare since it's not at the scale, but it could be, we could keep that. But is there any others that you felt like we should make sure to look at?
Would you please restate the states that you want?
I was saying, I looked at Mississippi because of their growth, California. I mean, DC certainly is up there, but again, whether that's apples to apples, I don't know.
In
Florida.
Okay.
You got Mississippi?
Mississippi, California,
Indiana
Florida.
also had an 8-point increase over 10 years.
So Indiana might be a nice 4th.
And North Carolina did too.
So maybe we do 5 and do North Carolina. So Mississippi, California, Florida, Indiana, and North Carolina.
Thank you.
That'll be interesting to see.
I think it might. It's a good mix.
And if all else fails, I can call my executive director friend at the DC State Board of Ed.
Yeah, and I was going to say, and I think we can maybe do some individual. I know we have Mississippi coming. We have a very good relationship, and they are actually going to come here in December. So preliminary information for them before they come, we could do that.
So that brings to mind that we're going to the NASB conference in a couple of weeks. So if we can have appointments with these states, that would be great. That would be just more qualitative sort of information. I think that would be interesting.
Chairman Clark, Member Wellborn, and you are attending NASB, correct?
That's right.
So you and
you're not
Deputy
going?
Director Baden
Okay.
can.
We have an assignment.
You have an assignment. You gave yourself an assignment.
Yeah, perfect. I was looking at her like you could do it.
No, hearing officer Clark. Oh my lord. Chair Clark, Member Wellborn. I will be attending the West Ed conference. That's in Scottsdale.
Okay.
So there's 3 all scheduled national conferences the same exact days this year. So we are sending staffers all over the place and board members.
Anything else that you saw? Anything else in the information presented this morning that raised questions, thoughts, said, hey, why don't we at this point look at this too? I mean, we have an opportunity to be very thorough here, and we just want to, I don't want you to not say something just because nobody else brought it up. And I see Sean signaling. Is there something, Sean, you would like to recommend?
I don't know if this is Chairperson Clark. I hope this is appropriate. Just because we're in touch with the field. We talk to every school, and some of the things that have bubbled up for us that people have asked. The cut score issue with the menu of assessments is actually probably chief among them. But we often get a question about a cap on the number of times a student can be retained in grades K-3. Mm-hmm. And currently in legislation, there is no limit. And so that might be something that this committee could address as well. I know that's a big concern for people in the field. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah. I know that has come up at the last time this group met, and we could revisit that conversation. Let's see. Yes.
I have a question too. Is there any tracking done of the students that are retained as to the effectiveness of that intervention? Is that something that has taken place?
You want to answer that, Sean, for what we hoped and where we're at?
Chairperson Clark, Member Burke, not currently. Mm-hmm. In fact, I apologize because one of the other changes I should have floated when I was up here a second ago is currently we track. We gather data very focused on K-3 and third grade in particular because we have AZ merit scores that come in. One of the areas that we are not currently tracking, and I won't say we aren't able, we don't currently have the funding to do it, but it would be great if we did, is what happens to those students who are retained. And then in particular, an area of interest for Sarah and I are also what happens to those students who just barely pass and then move to fourth grade. Mm-hmm. And, we're very careful in speaking to the field to very much message there's no need to wait for screening next year. These students need intervention. They should walk into it day one. And so it's something we try to message, but absolutely to have something more codified would be really helpful.
Sean, just to clarify, in the more reflective Move On When reading plans and the information that we're collecting, at one point we did want to collect what interventions those retained students are getting, and we don't have access to that information, or it's not. I'm sorry.
No, Chairperson Clark, we do collect that. We gather data, honestly, just sort of numerical data, percentage of which of the strategies they're employing. Mm-hmm. So we have that data. We don't have it as it follows for fourth grade students who who are still.
But that information would be something that you'd be interested in. So could you share that with us at some point? Could you get back to us on that?
Sorry, so just one caveat. We are currently gathering plans, and this is a year where only schools and districts with letter grades of C, D, or F submit. Mm-hmm. So Rob actually hinted at this. We have very incomplete data for this year. So I can use last school year if that's okay.
That was the point I was going to make, because a lot of the changes that were recommended were only implemented last year. Mm-hmm. Which was the first year that those were taken. And this year, A and B districts aren't submitting data. So again, that's a very good point. These are so new. Yeah.
But last year would be a whole.
We have a complete set from last year, so that would be fine. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
So it should be the right one. Great question. Thank you. Anyone else? Do you want to talk through sort of where we go next?
Yes. So, Chairwoman Clark, members of the committee, for item 8, future meeting dates and items for future agendas. So our next meeting will be October 24th. It's a Wednesday from 9 to 12. You obviously can come in person, but we will have a Google Hangout, so you can call in. And then our third will be November 7th at 9 a.m. That's also a Wednesday. After these first 3 meetings, we will try to make it very specific on the date and the time that we meet. That's helpful for my calendar. I know that's helpful for your calendars. So you have my email address. You also have Ketcher's. I think at one point you have Melissa's. So send us dates within a month. So if it's the 3rd Friday of the month, you're like, I'm always free on that Friday. If that works for you, send it to me, and then I can try to figure out going forward, maybe in January, if we meet once or twice a month, whatnot. But just looking into the December 3rd board meeting, at that October 24th committee meeting, what we would like to do is really have a discussion on the information that was presented today. Talk with your constituents, really sit down and think, what are my ahas? What are my you guys all know ahas, right? That's a teacher thing. Okay. What are my ahas? What are my hurdles? If I lived in a perfect world and funding wasn't an issue, what would I want to see? What would be my recommendation? What do I believe, or what do my constituents believe would push the needle in literacy? Again, not just third grade, but the whole spectrum. And we're going to just have an open dialogue and open discussion on your thoughts at the October 24th meeting. The one thing that I would love for you to do is, when you bring these aha moments and the struggles or your recommendations, please put them on paper, because what will happen is board staff working with this committee will create a report that we will give to the board at the December 3rd board meeting. So what that means is at the November 7th meeting, this committee will see a draft of that report. Okay. Board staff will also work on getting some of these questions that you had today answered. We'll work with ECS. We'll see what kind of data we can pull. And hopefully we can talk a little bit about that as well at the October 24th meeting. Is there any questions Chairwoman Clark, did I explain that correctly? Do you want to add anything?
I think you did. I think this group has to recognize, yes, we know it's a very aggressive timeline, but we need, we're always about what we need to do to make sure that kids are getting the supports they need, and so we have an aggressive timeline. We appreciate everyone's thoughtful attention and quick attention to getting us thorough feedback, and that's why you were selected to be on this committee, was to go back to your colleagues and your schools and get information and bring it back. So we really encourage you to do that in as timely a manner as you can. Anything else? Any questions that anybody has based on that? We'll try our best to facilitate the conversation on the 24th to really go through, like Alicia just explained. So,
and Chairwoman Clark, if the committee members, so the Wednesday 24th, I would probably try to get out Friday before the meeting, right? So you have over the weekend to review materials. So if anything that you have that's written that you want to get to me by October 19th, that's the Friday, would be great. And then, I don't know if you noticed in the agenda, but we did have a presentation and discussion on the K-3 Quality Initiative Partnership that was stricken from the agenda. So they may present at the October 24th meeting. I'm not too sure. We may have ECS be able to actually come in person and present. So we may have some agenda items that are, specifically just more informational. But if you can bring any of your ideas, your recommendations, your struggles, and then board staff, we can put all those together and have a really thorough discussion at the 24th meeting. Yes, Dr. Cruz.
Chairwoman Clark asked me just to address something that Dr. Vaghi brought forth in his report. When we looked at the no statistical significance between the core reading programs, something that wasn't addressed was just how that's being implemented and the fidelity to that program. That makes a huge difference when you're looking, does one outweigh another? So that's not data he collected. He just literally looked at the programs they were using and then looked at data. He didn't dig, that kind of next several levels deeper to see who's doing this with fidelity, who has had drift from that fidelity. And by fidelity, when you have a research-based program, if you don't use it as it's intended to be used when the research was done, then you're not going to get the same results that the research says you're going to get. So that's what they mean by research-based. And a lot of times that happens. We can all attest working in schools that you do this, you do professional development. When you get a reading program, and then if you don't have a robust way to continue to do that professional development with people, there's drift. And people tend to say, oh, I think this is probably better. I know they say this, but I kind of like to do it this way. And there's really no research-based reason why they're doing it, and it's not been proven. So I just wanted to throw that out there before we kind of go out and say, use any reading program you want. It makes no difference.
Right.
And that might be in your note to ECS, if they could see if they know of fidelity as a factor, because some, I believe, states actually have mechanisms to try to track fidelity.
And I'll just add on there that fidelity really applies to all of those components of malware. So the universal screeners, the diagnostics, the progress monitoring. If you are not doing that in a systematic way, the way that it should be done, then that is going to affect all the results. So just keeping in mind all of those variables and factors that kind of blow your mind when you start looking at it.
I would like to add to that. One of the things you had talked about earlier, and you're getting ready to go out and look at outliers. And one of the things we found in our own district when we took a look at some outliers in demographics who were outperforming, when we went in, we said, okay, we're utilizing similar programs, we're utilizing similar resources. What's the difference? The difference was in the implementation, the quality of the instructor and the implementation of those resources was what we found being the big difference on those outliers within our own little system. So it'll be interesting to see what you find, but that was our aha in our district, going back to the importance of the fidelity to
Found it more than once.
and its outcome on results. Yeah,
That's great.
Thank you.
Did you remember?
I just had another thought that might be of interest to this group. So I went a week or so ago, I went to a presentation from the Arizona Community Foundation that was on the topic of the teacher shortage. And I can't recite the data that they came up, but one of the issues that I was left with was this notion that we just have so much attrition, there's so much churn going on with younger teachers. So it's the older teachers tending to stay, it's the younger teachers that are not. So if there's a way to capture the teacher attrition and the shortage or the substitutes, and I don't know how to relate it, I just think it's definitely related to this challenge. And I'll see if we can just get a copy of that and send it to you as an FYI. It's part of the reality of you can do your professional development 1 year and think it's good, but then 2 years later, half your staff is gone. And do you have the funds to do it again?
I do have the link for that report if
Okay.
so we can get that to you.
That would be good to share with everyone.
Yeah. Anything else? Did we? All right. All right. Well, then I think we are comfortable formally adjourning.
Okay.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Sarah, for being here.
The 7th.